Right, here we go, 28th of June 2016, and we're here to talk with Josh about the sail training ships, the Malcolm Miller and Winston Churchill, and his experiences on them.
Which were all sort of now rather a long time ago, and memories of dear dead days. And in order to sort of provide some sort of key to it, I've brought my scrapbook here, Alan.
Okay, that's lovely.
And I suggest we try and flick through it quickly and just stop and chat as and when. Here are various bits of ephemera of people I can't even quite remember who they were. That was a postcard, some may remember, which was, I found that in Aberdeen Museum, but we had a nice print of it in the Malcolm Miller of Aberdeen Harbour, celebrated oil painting. Years ago, I started this many years back, and only comparatively recently put it into put it into an album form. And I picked up all sorts of stuff later. These were to do with the original schooners as they were built.
That's the chronographic file then?
Not completely. It's mainly my stuff, but then it provides a home for possibly the first picture ever made of the schooners by Cobb, with a massive flying jib which nobody would recognise at all. But in the fundraising days, and a general arrangement plan where you can see things were actually quite different in the first draft of it all. It was very much more of a barracks.
Yes.
And the permanent crew all had their own cabins, and it was very much more luxurious than later. I first sailed on a schooner in 1976 when I was 24, and I was at that time studying for a certificate in Plymouth, and the Malcolm Miller came in, and I happened by chance to be in the Royal Western Yacht Club with Chris Blake was the mate, and Bob Rowe was the captain, and they'd had a watch officer who'd had to leave, and so they suggested I might like to come and join them. So I did. I sort of came on board the next morning, and we sailed off with some celebrated individuals in schooner days, and I just did the last week of that cruise, and that was the first trip that I ever did. I probably would have sailed anyway, because I'd known of the ships since they were built. I remember the fundraising for Winston Churchill. There was a model of her which was touted round the coast in the early 60s and mid-60s, and came to Foy, and they were collecting money in the pubs. And in fact, among my sort of odd bits of possessions, I've got a collecting tin from those days, because even in those days perhaps things weren't as efficient as they might have been, and obviously somebody failed to collect the collecting tin, so I've got a collecting tin for Britain's sail training schooner, still with old pound shillings, well, probably no pounds in it, but pence and sixpences and goodness knows what.
You must have lived a good life, because most of those wind arrows are at right angles to the course lines.
Well, I think, I'm sure it was so. I'm sure it's still so. Of course, it must be so. But I mean, the part of the business of the sail training was to get the best out of the voyage, and to that effect, the ports were rarely very far apart. The secret of good sailor training ship operation is to sort of set yourself two ports, not too far apart, so that you can make the most of what wind there is. The mistake comes when you actually start wanting to sort of run a liner voyage, and you're going from Southampton to Scotland, and then you end up motoring the whole way, unless you're extremely lucky. And I suspect this is one of the difficulties that sail training ships have nowadays, is this sort of pressure to visit more adventurous destinations. At that time, you know, I mean, I can't remember what this one originally was. I joined in Plymouth, and we ended in Southampton. So that was a week. Well, you know, in that time we did Cherbourg, Cowes. That was the second half of the trip. And before I joined, they'd done St Malo and Weymouth. They were on the early bits. This was just my little bit, you know.
Right.
So that was my first trip. But I mean, and thereafter I sailed several times on the schooners during my sea career, during my Merchant Navy career with Blue Funnel, and kept all these track charts and captain's reports and things like that. Captain's reports are quite a disappointment, really, because very often I think captains didn't really want to say too much. And the reports in those days were in in two parts. There was a sort of abstract of where the ship had been and what she'd done and who the watch officers were. Then there was the second part, was the captain's narrative of the voyage, which depended very much on their penmanship, and some were better than others. And then there was a part 3, which was always rather secret. Nobody was supposed to sort of know what was in it. And they would report on particular things if there was sort of people on board, watch officers or whatever, who were possibly unsatisfactory in some sort of way, then this would be privately done. And in those days, without freedom of information, then these chaps could be quietly shelved, and this was sort of very much the thing. Only sometimes they weren't shelved. There was one case where the captain, I remember, who wrote this report, there had been one or two embarrassing incidents with the girls, and but the chap who was a fairly distinguished army officer, but he eventually appeared as a sort of member of a local committee, so it became rather difficult, really, because they'd already sort of made a sort of private sort of thought that perhaps he didn't quite fit, but he continued to sail very satisfactorily as a watch officer for some years, so maybe there was nothing much in it anyway. In those days, I say, of course, on the screen you can't see all this, and it doesn't really matter anyway, because I never was a particularly good photographer, and so I didn't have too many good photographs. But this was one of my early trips, and I remember here we were full of Janes. This was a girls' cruise. Colonel Burkett was the navigator. Jane Siddell was the watch leader. Now there's a name to conjure with. Jane Siddell eventually became Jane Bullivant and still sails in sail training ships, and I last saw her in the Canary Islands when she was in the Stavros Niarchos, and I was captain of the mega yacht A about 5 or 6 years ago, and it was very nice to see her again. But so Jane Siddell was my watch leader. I was a very young watch officer, I think younger than Jane actually, if she will forgive me, on that first full trip that I did, which was Southampton to Southampton Girls back in 1976. And I remember we had 2 Janes who were lighthouse keepers' daughters. Jane Evans became quite celebrated when there was a great sort of roar because something had been done incorrectly. She threw the rope down and said, "Don't shout so." Oh, all right. Names come up here, of course. Bob Rowe was captain for a good number of years, and there are probably permanent crew who can tell you much more about Bob Rowe. He's been dead a good few years now, which is rather sad. He was a very nice man, interesting man, but I think he suffered a little bit from a sort of megalomania nautica. I remember we had some Germans on board once, and Bob was a bit of a stickler for all things maritime, and captain's inspection, captain's rounds was always fairly grim for all of us, really. And Bob came round the galley, and it was all not quite up to scratch, according to Bob, although it kind of looked all right to the rest of us. And what these German students, who of course they were all sort of Z whatever it was, M11, F11 and Z11 were watch numbers. They were all on different watches, but then they ended up in the galley together. And so as Bob sort of retreated to the chart room, one of these Germans said, "All right, Captain," he says, "so you won the war." But Bob was a fine sailor and did some very fine sailing, and he hung in with the job for a very long time. A curious thing is that in those days, neither captains nor chief officers stayed very long. It was a sort of conventional wisdom that it was not good to have people to stay too long, and for a captain to stay more than 4 or 5 years was kind of unusual. And once you got up to the 8 years, which I think was Bob Rowe, and Barry Swindells was captain for about 8 years, then they began to feel the strain. And I remember Barry Swindells telling me very much that it was time that he left. he said the thing is that after a while there's always another storm. He said you can't look at the weather forecast without there being another storm coming. Here we have Winston Churchill and Foy. These are all trips before I started working for the Sail Training Association full time. This was a race which I did on the Winston Churchill, and it was from Plymouth to Liverpool, but it was the Manx Millennium, the Isle of Man's 1000th anniversary of the Manx Parliament. And it coincided with the famous Falkland, the famous, oh gosh, what do you call it, the Admiral's Cup thing.
Fastnet.
The Fastnet race, with that celebrated one when there was, we dodged most of that, but we suffered tremendous gales up in the Isle of Man.
When that happened, I was there.
Were you? You were in the Fastnet?
No, I wasn't. No? I was on a bulk carrier going south.
You were lucky to be in a nice big ship, because I think by the time the Fastnet gale hit, it was a double. It was a low on a low, and nobody in those earlier days of meteorology saw the second low coming, which swung round on the front. But we were by that stage up in the Isle of Man, so it was a very exciting trip. But it started terribly tragically. We were in Foy, and Barry rebuked himself terribly. He had no cause to, but we pulled out of Foy, and we had a little tacking and jibing practice before we had to go to the start line. And there was a small aircraft flying around taking photographs of all the wonderful tall ships. Or we were the biggest of them. It was what they called a minor year in those days, so it was smaller ships. And it was lovely weather, and we saw this aeroplane flying around. We hove off to the east in order to sort of do our tacking and jibing out of the way, and then came back for the start. But before the start could happen, this plane suddenly started behaving very oddly and crashed into the sea.
I know all about that one.
Were you around then?
No, but I was an instructor, a flying instructor at Bodmin at one stage, which is where the aircraft came from. Both the pilots were...
Up at Cardinham, or what?
Cardinham.
Oh, were you? Yes, yeah.
Both the pilots in that plane were airline pilots, and they had been flying jet-type aircraft, and they had forgotten a basic thing with a piston engine aircraft, which is carburettor icing. The temperature in your carburettor drops, and if you have low revs, the moisture comes into your carburettor, forms ice, blocks the carburettor, stops the engine, and that was the Accident Investigation Bureau's answer to that accident.
It was very, very sad, and I wrote here later that we were doing tacking practice to the east of Foy prior to the start of the race. A few minutes later, there was a sad accident. A light spectator aircraft crashed into the sea over to the west near the Canis Rock.
Yeah.
We handed all sail and motored over, but sadly arrived too late to help at all. Rona, which belonged to a London sailing project, had got to the plane and put a rope round its tail that was sticking out of the sea. One of her boys, a brave lad, dived in and managed to open the canopy. And he got first one boy and then another man out. First one man and then another man out. And then the aircraft sank. These two were obviously in the front seats.
Yes, they were the pilots.
Yeah, taking the two boys with it. The RN helicopter arrived quickly and found the plane with the first dive, which was itself fairly extraordinary. And one boy lived only a few minutes after being pulled out, but the other one got to hospital and died days later. And as we arrived at the Isle of Man, we heard that he had died. And that was a great sadness, and set that particular tall ships race off to a fairly bad start.
Yeah, the cause of that crash was carburettor icing.
Yeah,
because the guys were used to running jets, not piston engine aircraft.
It was a great shame.
Yeah.
And I think I should know his name, but I don't know his name. But his name still lives because he's I think the boy. I'm not sure now who, but the name lives in one of the tall ships prizes. There's a prize in the tall ships race every year, I believe now. Here we had at this time Barry Swindells was the captain, and again I'm sure there are other members of the permanent crew. I never sailed with Barry as a permanent crew, but I did sail with him several times as navigator.
Yeah.
And we shared a blue funnel background. So, and he was a man that life was rich with rich with yarns with Barry Swindells.
You mentioned Chris Blake as the chief officer on one of the earlier cruises.
He was chief officer the first time I sailed. He went back to P&O, and then eventually came back to schooners as captain.
Yep.
And when I joined the schooners as mate, in 70, well, I can't remember now, 73, 74, something like that. No, 83, sorry, 83, 84. He was still with the schooners, but he left very soon after that and went to Hong Kong, where he commanded the brigantine Jifeng for the Outward Bound School. He took various sail training people. Bob Lamoureux went over with him. And in due course, when he was offered the command of Britain's gift to Australia, the Young Endeavour, at the Australian Bicentennial, he left that job and phoned me up one morning. So I ended up out in Hong Kong and had a very nice 3 years in Jifeng, in the South China Sea. It had its merits. There were lots of good things about that, but as sail training goes, it was something of a pale imitation to sail training as we knew it in the STA. That might be slightly unfair judgment, because Outward Bound had different agendas really to sail training.
He's still around. I met him in 2014 commanding the Pelican.
Oh, I only just missed seeing him a few months ago on the Malcolm Miller. He was, after she came out of her fine refit, he was sailing. He sailed on her down as far as Plymouth. I went on board and looked at the Malcolm Miller in her new guise. This was 2 years ago, but unfortunately missed Chris, so I haven't seen him for some little while. And then I don't know, have I joined yet? Now I don't know. Yes, this is when I have joined. So my first voyage. So I joined the Sail Training Association on the start. My early trips were on the Winston Churchill, but in fact I was always, I think, more strongly identified with the Malcolm Miller at that time. All sorts of people. Martin Jackson. Lots of people remember Martin. He was a wonderful fellow, a very good watch officer, always cheerful and encouraging and very humorous. But he was rather accident prone. He fell overboard in port. And I remember he fell overboard, I think in Foy. I think he fell overboard in port. And this particular voyage, there was an amusing incident when he and I came off watch at 4 o'clock in the morning, remembering, of course, that the watch officers kept the watch on the bridge, running the watch, and the permanent crew navigator sort of monitored things down in the chart room and were responsible for the navigation. So we came off watch at 4 o'clock in the morning, and throughout the watch he had reported visibility getting hazy, and every time I went up it was in fact perfectly clear. Martin stayed in the chart room writing the logbook while I went and quietly turned in the 4-berth cabin. Then Martin came down and started to get ready for bed, and then announced he'd lost the contact lens. Great disturbance as he searched for it on the deck. Put the lights on, crashing around, waking everybody up. And then some triumph when he found it, and it turned out that he'd put them both in the same eye. And this accounted for why he thought it was hazy throughout his watch. After I left the SDA, I'm afraid he died in Alderney in a rather Martinish accident. He was sailing as bosun, I think, and operating the Gemini boat. And coming alongside on his own, he stopped the boat, moved forward to throw the painter. He missed, turned round, and stood up whilst restarting the engine, which sadly was in gear. The boat leapt forward, Martin shot over the stern into the water, and he was still laughing, I believe, as the boat, circling, ran over him and cut open his skull with the propeller. He's rather a sad loss, actually, Martin. He was a very, very fine man, and he regularly sailed on tall ships races, and that was interesting because he sailed with Mark Comispetti. Mark Comispetti was another of the old captains, ex-Navy, and a very fine yachtsman. And I always had a lot of respect for Mark. He was a very, very competitive yachtsman. He sailed competitively in, I'm not sure it wasn't, no, it was those Isle of Wight boats, the V boats down in the Isle of Wight. But tall ships races to him were races. I mean, he was very, very sort of competitive on them. But Mark Kemispetti recognised this in himself and realised that actually you needed to have somebody to lighten it up. So he always had Martin Jackson along with him. He had a couple of watch officers who were very keen yachtsmen, very competitive, but he always had Martin along with him to sort of just take the edge off it, because life could get, tall ships race with Mark KB, life could get a bit too serious sometimes, you know. So we owed that to Martin. He was a fine fellow. Other names here, of course, Peter Ellis was another fine watch officer of days gone by, an ex-bank manager. Very good egg. He had his own boat and he used to go sailing, but his wife didn't like sailing, so he sailed with this girl, I can't remember her name now. Who was obviously quite young, much younger than him, and very pretty. But in those days, we rather respected bank managers, and it never crossed anybody's mind, including his wife's, I think, that there could ever be anything more in this than the fact that they sailed together. But I can't remember what her name was now, but he had a funny story, because he had been sailing with his wife on some occasion, and he asked her what was the pudding, and she said, "Pudding?" He said, "There isn't any pudding. I don't make puddings." "Oh," he said, "Denise would." But and this was again a very early trip before we went to refit. In those days, we refitted in Southampton. Sorry, I'll get it right in a minute. In the West India Dock in London. And they had been doing that for a number of years, and there was a floating dock which belonged to Blackwell Engineering Company. In those days, before the West India Docks were developed, it was a real derelict area, and the berth was therefore free or cheap or something, and we had the whole new sort of warehouse to lay everything out in. And we had a load of volunteers, girls and boys, who would come and stand by the ships and do a lot of the labouring work, and we had tame welders like Dougie Cann, and Ken Groom, who was the mate, was a trained boat builder. He used to do all the joinery and the woodwork to a very high standard. But it was fairly sort of rugged, really, because there was no facilities as such. We sort of, the ships were laid up, so it was a bit of a job sort of getting around everything. But I think, again, one of these things, happy days on the whole, people would remember. But there came a celebrated day. I don't have a photograph of it, but I'm not even sure it was that. Maybe it was the following year. It must have been the following year when the dry dock sank. The floating dock sank. There is a tale to. There is a tale to talk of.
Embarrassing.
Yes, we'll come to that. That was the following year. Again, all these track charts, Honfleur.
Well illustrated.
Well, as I say, I never was very methodical on it. Eameshaven, we went here. This was a trip in number 280 on Malcolm Miller in April 1984. Eameshaven, which I'd never heard of. We went to Delfzijl up in the north of Holland.
Yes.
And we then heard from the agent that Barry Swindells, who had left by that time and was a North Sea pilot, and he was on board a ship coming down a car carrier, a Russian car carrier, and he was serving as pilot. And she was going into this port called Eameshaven, which nobody's ever heard of. And when we got there, we decided we'd go and meet Barry there. So we went to his place, Eameshaven. There's nothing there at all. Just it was a huge harbour with, I think, one tanker laid up. No quays or wharfs or jetties or warehouses had been built. It had been built some years before. I think the Dutch were so pleased with the success of Europort that they decided they would do the whole thing again, and they built this massive facility. But at that time, anyway, it had never taken off, and so there it was, and it was a lovely safe haven. But there was nowhere to go. There was no town or anything. So we had a barbecue. It was a girls' cruise again, and eventually, late in the night, much later than we thought, this car carrier turned up, and we dutifully sent the boat across, and we found Barry and brought Barry back. And then we had to wake all the girls up because they'd all gone to bed by then, and we had to get the cook up to go and make some omelettes or sandwiches or something. And And we had a really, 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 really good late night party with Barry. Possibly the last time he ever performed for the Schooners, because he was something of a musician. He had a banjo. He didn't have it with him on that trip, but he used to take a banjo to sea with him, which he'd made himself years before. But he also carried, I don't know what it's called now, I dare say it's an improper name, but a thing called a Jew's harp, which people used to play to the mouth, and he had that in his breast pocket. So he regaled us with all the old party pieces for which he was quite famous. And that, I think, is the last time I saw Barry, and that's a long time ago.
Where are we at now? 19?
We're now in the 80s, 1984, so this was a year after I joined. I was in the Schooners. I was there 3 years. Hartlepool, Newcastle.
British West Hartlepool.
Yes, British West Hartlepool. Laid up ships, everything. Frank Morgan, who was an occasional watch officer, I knew him in my own life in Foy as well.
Right.
He was an interesting fellow. He was an engineer commander, but his friend Foy, and very long-standing friends of mine. But he was in his 70s, I suppose. He sailed as a watch officer, and I remember this time when I met him, and he told me that, you know, he'd promised his wife, he was very sorry about it, but he wouldn't go aloft, because he'd promised his wife that he wouldn't, because he was getting a bit old, and so he wouldn't go aloft. And then the silly old bugger went and fell over on the gangway and split his head open. didn't even get off the deck, you know. So it just shows you. We always used to say that, in fact, being aloft was, for trainees, was the safest place, because the one thing you could rely upon with young people going aloft without very much experience was that they were going to hold on tight. And in my experience, it's perfectly true that the accidents that we had, and we probably did have quite a lot of accidents, really, happily none very serious, but we did have endless sort of bumps and bangs and cracked bones and things like that. But they always happened. And in fact, the most dangerous place, really, was mealtimes, because, you know, people would think they were still in a house, so they'd be passing teapots over to each other with the whole of their environment tossing and turning, which
and
they weren't used
over,
to, and leaning over. But once you sort of were on deck and aloft, I mean, if one thing you do was hang on tight. And the Schooners were very lucky in that respect, you know, or my theory is borne out. There were very, very few accidents aloft. Well, everybody will remember there was a tragic loss of a boy off the bowsprit at one stage in Liverpool Bay, right towards the end. And there was a watch officer who fell off the yard before my time. But when you think of 30 plus years of service, 2 ships, all those youngsters, and really hardly anything in the way of serious accidents, it's a testament to the way we were, I suppose, because health and safety didn't quite have the sort of administrative burden that it now has. But we were very, very safety alert, I think, all the time. And I think that conveyed itself to the trainees.
That's always been true with square rig ships, where people have had to go aloft for a long time.
I'm sure it has. I'm sure it has. But you know, when you compare it to the sort of way the different emphases as things are later, you know, have become more recently. But yes, so this was a Moira Simpson. Anybody remember Moira Simpson? I don't know. She was a very regular watch officer, always known as Tonka, on account of being tough, indestructible, and fun to play with.
Wing.
Yeah, she was great fun. She used to spend her sort of winters doing skiing and her summers doing sailing. She was a great girl. Eendracht, the old Eendracht. Who remembers the old Eendracht with the blue sails before they built the new one? Yeah, much smaller.
Yes.
Yeah.
Much more yacht-like.
Yes, much smaller.
The new one in the Canaries.
Even in those days, they used to call her the floating begging bowl, because like all sail training ships, they were always short of money.
Mm.
And like the schooners, she was one of very few, actually, that were entirely charitable. Of course, there are many of the smaller vessels, the yachts, who run on such a basis, but of larger ships, there are very few. Most of them have some sort of government money in one way or another.
I worked for the Curden Trust for a while. That's all completely charitable.
Yes, but they were slightly smaller, weren't they?
Yes,
You
they
know,
were 30, 40 metre
Yeah,
jobs.
they're still quite big ships, aren't they? But this was, oh gosh, now what was her name? Oh dear. Yes. Alison Spritzler Rose. Mark Chemis-Betty might remember Alison. She was a very vivacious and dynamic American, and so completely uninstitutionalized. She was complete maverick, absolute maverick. And she joined the ship. Mark Chemis-Betty was the captain. And which trip were we on? I can't remember where the hell we were now. Oh, here we are, Southampton. Mark Chemis-Betty was the captain. And she joined the ship, and people will perhaps remember that the first evening was always intense training. The kids would join, and then endless sort of training, quite a tight routine to get everything organised. And then hopefully the next day we could get away in the morning and go out and do a little bit of tacking and jibing in the outer approaches to the port, and then set off.
Climbing drills,
Climbing drills and safety and all this sort of thing. Yeah. But in between, of course, people still had to be fed, so supper had to be made, and the first galley rats had to sort of turn to and deal with the washing up and that sort of thing. And I think, if I remember rightly, the 11s were always the three number 11s, one of each watch. They were always galley rats on the first night, if I remember correctly. I think it all started with always the 11. So this Alison Spritzer Rose must have been in 11. And I went into the galley after supper, and the training was all in thing. And there was only two of them there. Who's the other galley rat? And it was this girl called Spritzler Rose, Alison Spritzler Rose. And where is she? Oh, she's having a shower. Having a shower? You're supposed to be busy. Go down, get her out of the shower. Tell her to get up here, I want to see her straight away. And I went back to the chart room and busied myself. And the next thing is the door opened, and there came this Alison. No clothes, just wet from the shower. And just at that moment, up the gangway, up the stairs from the lower cabin, came Mark Chemis-Betty. What's going on? Big panic. But she was completely unfazed by it. And I later got this letter from her. Dear Chief Officer Josh, I just got a letter from the dubious Martin Tasker, who says you say hello. Hello too. So she goes on and on. I still have become a full-time student, blah, blah, blah. How was Denmark? I wish I'd made it to the reunion. We used to have a reunion every winter for the trainees, or regular attendees really, but also particularly the trainees of that particular year.
I think the one this autumn should be good value.
Yeah, but this was an annual event,
I
which was mainly targeted at the trainees who had sailed that previous year. And she wasn't able to come, but I said I also wish I could have made it to the reunion. I'd have loved to see that captain. That was Mark Chemis-Betty. I'd love to see that captain once more, but just once. Yeah, she was.
Some lively people over the years.
Lots of lively people. Lots of lively people.
Ah, yes, there we go.
Ah, there's Charlie. Yeah, Wing Nin Charlie Chan was Cook's assistant. Yeah. Again, this is a tall ships race. You can always tell. Donald Wistons, Peter Hodgson.
He always abbreviates that Cook's assistant.
Yes, I know he does. Yes. Oh, it was a very common abbreviation in those days. Yes. This was the first trip of Adrian Allenby, who joined as captain, and again stayed for a number of years, and was another very very good chap. There's an enormous amount of sort of PR work for the schooners. He had a bit more patience with people than was normal. But Adrian was I ended up sailing with him quite a lot. He was a good chap, Adrian. I don't want to talk too many stories about Adrian, because I'm sure you can interview him yourself. You recognise that one, won't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This was the great Velshida. The chap, this is Velshida we're talking about, who was
Yeah.
the great J-class yacht in her, what you might call her second incarnation. She was restored and put back into service. But I think it was a bit of a ramshackle job, and then later since then she's been restored again.
Properly, yes.
But nevertheless, she did sail there. Now, Frank Morgan, who I mentioned before, the old stumblebum naval chap who fell on the gangway, it was quite interesting because he had actually sailed in Velshida. Amazing when you think how history is, and he's now dead and gone. But Frank Morgan had sailed in Velshida in Cowsweek in 1936. In 1935. He was senior midshipman of the guard ship, which I think was HMS Iron Duke, one of the battleships